Our lesson question today revolves around the different types of selection and how they can alter biodiversity. Now we need to realize that Darwin's theory of evolution is driven by the process of natural selection. And this is where organisms which are better adapted to their environments tend to survive longer, reproduce more, increase in number, and then pass these traits on to succeeding generations. That's where we're headed in this next segment. All right, when we talk about natural selection, we talk about a process of evolutionary change. There must be variation within the population. Natural selection has to select for one trait over another. Imagine this population of beetles on the screen. We have variation in their coloration. So for the color of their exoskeleton, we have a green variant and a brown variant. So therefore we have variation at this gene location, this gene for color. Overpopulation. In many instances, the environment cannot support the number of individuals that are created in each generation over time. There aren't enough resources, there aren't enough mates, some get eaten. In this population, let's imagine that the green beetles are more easily seen by birds and therefore get eaten at a higher rate. So therefore, their number decreases. Now, this leads to adaptation, which is an inherited or a learned trait that increases an organism's chance of survival in its environment. So what happens? At the end of the generation, there are more brown beetles who reproduce and pass that trait on so that in the next generation, that brown trait, that brown phenotype is in higher frequency. This is the process of natural selection. It is a change in the population through genetic variation over time. Charles Darwin predicted that natural selection could be responsible for the evolution of new species, or the emergence of new species, through the process called speciation. What is this formally? It's the evolutionary process by which a new species emerges. What do we mean by a species? We mean that a group of organisms that can breed with each other and produce offspring. You can see on the screen, the world is filled with dozens and dozens of species of butterflies, if not more. Each species of butterfly has their own traits and cannot reproduce with other species of butterflies. If they could reproduce, then they'd be members of the same population. But if they cannot reproduce with each other, then they are their own species. How does this occur? Well, there are two different phases. All right. The first is geographic isolation. Species or populations that get separated from each other geographically, they cannot reproduce. So say butterflies or birds get washed out to sea in a hurricane. Well, they find refuge on an island. But without those hurricane winds, they cannot travel back to the mainland to find a mate. Well, this institutes reproductive isolation. This happens when you're geographically isolated. You cannot find a mate on the main island, so therefore gene flow stops between populations. And selective pressures can act on those populations independent of each other. Now, reproductive isolation can occur if you're not geographically isolated, but it's a slower process, a little harder to understand. So think of it in very basic terms here of you have geographic isolation, you're physically separated from each other, which means you cannot reproduce. The results of speciation mean that you have a change in your existing species. Maybe you are one species and you diversify and form many different species, like on the Galapagos Island with the finches. Or maybe you are at the beginning of the process and you still stay as one population, but you diverge from the mainland population and your evolutionary paths go in different directions with different selective pressures. This results in at least 2 different species if the time frame is long enough so that the populations can no longer reproduce if they were brought back together. All right? And we see this with the different beak size and shapes on the Galapagos Islands. We've also seen this in other examples. Take, for example, the lemurs of Madagascar. Today, there are over 30 living species. Once there were 40. 10 species have gone extinct. Where did these come from? It's believed that all 40 of these species originated from one primate, one small population of primates that made it from the African mainland to the island of Madagascar over 60 million years ago. Another example coming from the plant kingdom are the Hawaiian silver swords. You'll see many endemic species or species that have evolved on islands like Hawaii because they're so geographically isolated from the mainland. Very rare that organisms can travel back and forth and carry genes with them. There are 30 different species of silver swords, and they're believed to have originated on the Hawaiian Islands from one ancestral species over 8 million years ago. So, when you're isolated and you have different selective pressures, then you can diverge into separate, distinct populations when you can no longer reproduce with members of that other population. Up to this point, we've talked about natural selection in general affecting biodiversity and the process of how it works. In this next segment, we're going to talk about the different types of natural selection and focus on disruptive, stabilizing, and directional selection. Within any population, there's a certain distribution of traits. So, take something like human height. You see far more people of average height than you do at either extreme. And that's what we call a distribution curve. There are many people right here in the middle, shown by the frequency of individuals with a certain trait. So there are more people up here that have the middle trait. And so let's say if this is height, you have tall over here and short over there. And so therefore there's a spectrum for a certain trait. Most individuals in the population will have the middle ground, some intermediate of the two extremes. So are there really tall people? Yes, but their number is very small. Are there very short people? Yes, but their number is very small. As you get closer to the middle, your frequency goes up. We call this a bell curve or a normal distribution. This is what you see normally if there's not any selective pressures going on. But a change in the ecosystem can disrupt or change the distribution of traits because certain traits will be selected for and others will be selected against. So what this affects is the biodiversity of the population. This is the total variety of organisms that live in the biosphere and all the traits that they have, all the instructions in those genes for creating all those traits. So what we have is a way of measuring here the biodiversity by measuring the distribution of certain traits. Now, real-world connection for you is the Encyclopedia of Life. Have you ever heard of E.O. Wilson? He's one of the foremost biologists in the world. He works at Harvard, and he started a project with the scientific community, many other scientists, in 2007 with the goal of providing information on all of the world's species, both plants and animals, including insects and all the various microbes of the world. All right? So that means looking at forest ecosystems and marine ecosystems. It looks at all of the microbes, both within you and me, and all the different plants and insects of the world. A monumental task, working with universities and government agencies and individual researchers to try and catalog all of these species in a central database that is searchable and that you can draw connections and understand the differences between and the similarities of certain species and cataloging all the different species of life. Currently, we've got about 40% of the species cataloged, but with a changing environment and some species going extinct, it's important to get this work done sooner rather than later. The project is scheduled to be completed around 2017, so be on the lookout for those results. Now let's take a look at the different types of natural selection, or different modes. The first is directional selection. Directional selection is a process by which one of the extreme variations of a trait is favored. And therefore what happens is the bell curve will shift. All right? We'll go over each of these in more detail in just a moment. The second type of selection is disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is a process by which individuals with either extreme are favored, and the intermediate form is selected against. This results in a bimodal curve, or a curve with two distinct peaks, which separate over time into distinct species. More to come in just a moment. The third type of selection is stabilizing selection. This is where the two extremes are selected against, which means that the intermediate form is favored. All right, we've talked about each of these just a little bit. Now let's go into more detail. First is directional selection. So in this example, in this mode, one type of extreme is favored. And so therefore, you see the original population, whose peak is right here, shifts in a certain direction. And therefore, one of the extremes is favored, and one of the extremes is selected against. So what happens? It moves in a certain direction. Hence, it's called directional selection. What are the effects? Well, it can lead to the evolution of a new species, but you don't increase in biodiversity. The old species becomes the new species. You don't have two different species. The new species kind of replaces the old species. Examples. So the neck to giraffe. Over time, there were mutations that arose within the giraffe population that allowed them to have slightly longer necks, which meant those giraffes could have access to more food. More food meant a better chance at survival and more reproduction, which led to the favoring of longer necks, which over time selected against shorter necks, and longer necks were the norm. And the process went in that direction of longer and longer and longer necks. Another example is the pink salmon. So one of the misconceptions about evolution is that bigger, stronger, faster is always favored. Not so. In the 1940s, they started paying fishermen by the size of the salmon that they brought in on their fishing expeditions instead of the sheer number. So fishermen designed nets to catch the larger salmon, and the smaller salmon could swim through the nets. So who survived each generation? The smaller salmon. And they reproduced more than the larger salmon, which led to a trend towards smaller salmon. Over this span, from 1945 to today, we've seen a reduction by 30% or more in the mass of the pink salmon that are caught. So now you have directional selection in a different extreme. Notice, this isn't two different species. It's one species which changes its phenotype over time. This is called directional selection, directed towards one extreme or the other. Okay. The second mode of natural selection that I'd like to talk to you about is disruptive selection. Now, in disruptive selection, you have the original population, and there's a selective pressure right here against the intermediate phenotype. What are you selecting for? You're selecting for either extreme, so therefore you see an increase in the frequency of those two traits at the extremes and a decrease in the frequency of the intermediate phenotype. This is called a bimodal curve, or simply a curve with two distinct peaks. What are the effects of this? Well, you have two different species originating from one common ancestor. This is the process of speciation. It leads to an increase in genetic variation and biodiversity because now you have natural selection working on two independent populations, mutations arising in two separate populations of which natural selection can act upon and create new, more diverse species. Good example of this are limpets. Right? Limpets are marine organisms that camouflage themselves against rocks. Okay? Now birds prey upon the limpets and feed off of them. So you have a whole range of variation. You have white limpets, as you can see on the bottom, and brown limpets, and then you have an intermediate tan color. Well, the brown limpets can camouflage on brown rocks, and the white limpets can camouflage on white rocks, but the intermediate tan color shows up against the brown and shows up against the white. Therefore, the birds can easily see them and pick off the beige or tan limpets. Therefore, you're selecting against the intermediate phenotype. Over time, this has led to separate populations which no longer reproduce with each other. This is the road going down to speciation. A third mode of natural selection is called stabilizing selection. And this is where the two extremes are selected against. Notice, we don't like this extreme, we don't like that extreme, so what do we see? We see an increase in frequency in the intermediate phenotype, a narrowing of the curve. And what this is called is stabilizing selection. So what are the effects? Well, you don't get any adaptive change. Instead, you select for that intermediate phenotype, which stabilizes you and prevents you from moving towards either extreme. There's a decrease in diversity because we're losing alleles on this side and losing alleles on that side as they are selected against. And what results is the population looks more and more similar over time. A good example of this are the weaver birds of Africa. So they play a very delicate game of balancing starvation with the ability to catch prey. Food is very sparse on the African savanna, and so birds have to go a long time between meals. So therefore, you'd think it would be good to be more massive and put on fat and store energy for the times when meals are scarce. However, if I do that, if I'm a bird and I build up my fat content, I get larger and I'm less agile. Two things: it makes me easier to see from other predatory birds, and it makes me less agile in catching my prey. So therefore, on one hand, it would be good to be heavier. On the other hand, it's not good to be heavier. It's better to be smaller and more agile. So therefore, since there's a selective pressure on either side, you see that the intermediate phenotype are the most successful in this environment and are selected for. Those are our three modes of selection. We just talked about stabilizing. Before that, there was disruptive. And before that, there was directional. All modes of natural selection.